Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in. On this episode of the podcast, host Craig Jeffery joins Jonathan Paquette, Senior Financial Solutions Expert at Treasury Intelligence Solutions, to discuss the concept of examining an enterprise payment optimization mindset. Topics of discussion center around payment pain points, innovative technology solutions, optimizing outbound payments, best practices, and more. Listen in to find out how to achieve global connectivity across banks, systems, and providers while positioning your organization for success.
John, welcome back to the Treasury Update podcast. It's good to speak to you again on this platform.
Thanks, Craig. Yeah, good to be here too.
I think it'd be good if you could go into a quick tour of your career so everyone knows, where you've come through and how that influenced the discussion of enterprise payment optimization mindset. You work at TIS, which is what we refer to as a treasury aggregator, connecting to banks for information, for payments, and managing workflow. But maybe you could give us a quick overview of your career before we get into EPO.
Yeah, sure. Happy to do that. So, John Paquette, I'm the head of customer success for our U.S. market for TIS. That involves overseeing our solutions architects team, our customer onboarding team, some partner engagement activities and partner onboarding type activities as well. So joined TIS back in 2019. Prior to that, really all of my experience was as a treasury practitioner directly. So I have 15 years experience in the industry, really tackling a lot of these topics from an industry perspective as well. Most recently, I was the treasurer for a U.S.-based healthcare organization here as well. So I've really seen things from both sides, both the practitioner side and the technology side.
Yeah, that's excellent, and we're looking to hear how you share those multiple perspectives on this concept. So, the enterprise payment optimization mindset. We're talking about this as a concept. I thought it would be helpful if you start off with a few elements of EPO. What is EPO broadly, or enterprise payment optimization? How would you define that more broadly?
Yeah, sure. Happy to do that. So, I really think of EPO from two different perspectives. First, it's a state that you can get to within your payments process and being fully optimized, right? But we also think of it as almost our product. What we do at TIS, we sell EPO for organizations as well, right? So, just to pull the term apart a bit here, enterprise payments. Here we're talking about a structure that really takes into consideration all payments across the organization. These are treasury payments, AP payments, HR payments, whatever your organization is really processing. And historically, these payment processes have really been siloed and operated independently of each other. There's no global owner of payments, but rather they kind of sit with multiple different departments who might have chosen different ways to execute them, right? So you have to make payments, and if no one strategically decided how that's going to be done, you have processes that are more or less built on necessity, right? So, and that's really where you run into issues in terms of having these siloed processes. So the optimization side of this really refers to the efficiencies to be had by breaking down these silos. In the case of EPO, unifying these processes from a transactional data standpoint through an EPO tool specifically, right? So, and once you unify these processes, you gain all sorts of advantages. You simplify the bank connectivity that was probably the barrier to you achieving straight-through processing to begin with within your organization. You gain a lot of process improvements, the ability to really put in place things like consistent payment approval processes and controls across all of your payment processing centers. You gain visibility over the entire payment process for a day-to-day basis for a transactional standpoint. You can use your payment instruments more efficiently through either batching or using things like least cost routing or payment factories and payment on behalf of. Really, the list kind of goes on and on here. So there are these process improvement perspective of it as well. But maybe, the most important aspect of this is that you really unchain the data, so to speak, right? You free it from these silos that it was historically trapped in, as these processes were really managed separately. Historically, this data has been really hard to get at for organizations, but it's important to leverage for better decision making and actually to be more strategic, in your payment activity as well. So people don't commonly think of payments as being strategic necessarily, but they can be, really if these processes are managed correctly. And then from a product standpoint, EPO, right? I think of it as just essentially this toolbox of technology that provides you with everything you need to get to that optimized state. So simplified methods of connecting to your banks, format transformation capabilities so that all banking relationships can effectively speak to one another, workflows and integrated alert management so that all of these payment approvals and the visibility of the payments is really ingrained in your normal day-to-day process, and then also API capabilities to be able to connect to all of your applications, but also to be able to access that data that I was talking about there too, and pull that into various analytics tools or even a data lake or something like that.
Yeah. So you said quite a bit there that was excellent, and something that I want to come back to a couple parts. One is about the unchaining data, and the other is how you described it. And I want to pull and tease apart how that's different from a payment hub, which a lot of those items are very much overlapped with a payment hub, but there's also, sounds like a little bit of process there. But I want to pull that in a little bit later. But first, I wanted to hear your thoughts on, enterprise level pain points. Taking this comprehensive approach or an enterprise level approach to addressing payment issues, whether, like you said, it's connectivity or formats or compliance. As you look at this, solving this whole suite of challenges or problems that come up for all of these silos or heretofore silos, like AP, payroll, treasury. Can you talk about the pain points that you've seen as a practitioner, and that you're talking to people every day about this now? So what are the pain points that you hear about as an advisor on payments, on this topic?
Yeah, for sure. One common pain point I've seen both as a practitioner and advising customers on this as well is that, because there's no global owner of the payment process, there's nobody to really drive these initiatives strategically, right? There's Treasury, that's your gatekeeper to the banking relationships. They're making the introductions, they're kicking off the projects. They're also responsible for the company's liquidity picture, so they want to have visibility into how the cash is moving across the business. But likewise, not really driving fully how payments are being processed within the organization itself, right? So typically, more so driving it from a project standpoint, not from a strategic standpoint, and a supporting role with conversations with the banks. And so there's nobody advising these more broader departments like AP and payroll on best practice payment initiation. I think this is a big reason why these processes end up so siloed to begin with. Everyone kind of runs in their own direction once these projects get kicked off, and there's no real unification in mind.
That's interesting. You talk about the ownership, right? In some areas, I guess Treasury would look as an observer, right? Maybe they observe, or maybe they're oblivious to what's going on process-wise. They obviously have, like you said, the banking relationship. They want to know what funds are being used, but maybe they don't worry about compliance activities as much, or security. These are massively important topics now that there's whole new payment rails, new payment formats. There's an increased sophistication on security attacks and inconsistent processes, non-current security practices. All threaten an organization from a risk and a cost perspective. So as you look at that and you see that being a common element of pain across organizations, why is that the case? And you and I had a conversation earlier about receivables and payments. Do you have any more comments on that type of topic? Why is payments? Do you see payments behind receivables in a focus here, or?
Yeah, I'd say so. I'd say that historically, companies definitely spend a lot more attention focusing on their receivables, collecting cash quickly. How does that impact cash flow? Your ability to keep, a low DSO, for example, or something in line with your cash projections. But the payments process doesn't get quite as much attention, really, right? So, that's definitely a big problem for organizations. You also brought up some good points in terms of the technology issues that most organizations face too, right? So how to secure these processes, how to deal with things like file formats and things like that if you don't have anybody advising them. And it's not uncommon for organizations to run into issues with those topics, I think. after the project's already started, right? So maybe during the course of the project, they contemplated payment file formats, but they come to find out that it's not broadly supported across all payment instruments that they use, for example. And then you end up with organizations that have, the bulk of their domestic ACH payments going out through straight-through processing, but if they have different payment instruments like international payments, or even payments with other banks that aren't their main cash management banks, they then have to fall back to manual processes and things like that, right? Because it really wasn't considered holistically during the course of the project. So common pitfalls, I think, for organizations to fall into.
Yeah, when you talked about liquidity, you think of how can I have better visibility across the board to disbursements as a key component of managing liquidity. If everything's all over the place, now you've got many, many more feeds of data. You got to solve those problems in a different way than if you've taken a comprehensive approach. Certainly, some significant issues there. And as you were talking, it just made me think about these fragmented processes. About the reason they're silos is historical, but it's also somewhat of a turf war. This whole hey, AP owns their process. They know how to approve payments and set up vendors and do that. But where do they tend to become less experts and someone else should take it over? And where do you draw the lines?
Yeah, no, this is a great topic and something that gets brought up all the time. I think when we have these types of conversations, Treasury doesn't want to necessarily own the payment process in the sense that they're really in the weeds on everything that's happening on a day-to-day basis and the processing of AP and payroll-related payments. Likewise, like you mentioned, AP wants to own that as well. So Treasury's role, I think, is more so as the advisor, the technology that's being used to initiate those payments. Is it best practice? Is it leading edge here? Are we following the right financial controls and process controls and initiating that payment activity? I think from that standpoint, these other departments would gladly welcome the help and identifying from a technology standpoint the best way to do this. And it puts Treasury in a good position, I think, as more so an advisor than really being involved in every single process out there. And this is exactly what EPO does. It gives the treasurers a tool that they can use for this purpose, right? All that toolbox of different methods that they can use to really put all these processes in place as one centralized process. It gives them all the solutions and allows them to kind of facilitate and act as this advisor within the business.
I want to come back to that last point about the central activity, because there's a system and there's areas, and maybe we can tease out some of that. Maybe those aren't important, but I wanted to follow up on a part about the fragmented processes from different areas and extend that into there's additional compliance requirements that are coming, and every area that has payments has to do additional compliance work, whether it's validating banking information, confirming when there's changes. So there's both the legal framework for that, but also the controlling, you don't want to lose money. And then there's also, in addition to regular payment changes, payment system changes, ERP systems, for the most part, there's a huge push. If they're not in the cloud, they're moving to the cloud, whether it's SAP or Oracle, Workday's in the cloud. I mean, there's massive movements and changes for some of these systems that generate a lot of payments. So maybe you could talk to that, those pain points too.
Yeah, for sure. From a regulatory perspective, quite commonly a lot of countries these days are requiring additional verifications within the payment files themselves, whether it be beneficiary name and address is verified, or certain purpose of payment type information is required within the payment file itself. These are important components that organizations need to get into those files. And when they're kind of managing this on their own, it might not be top of mind. It might be something that kind of slips their mind during the course of the project. But it's certainly something that through EPO is almost automated, right? It's ingrained into the payment processes to make sure that that's actually contemplated, and you can get 100% of your payment activity, even those more exotic payments, really flowing through that centralized hub too, right? So, and then the migration to cloud, I mean, very, very common these days. We're seeing a ton of organizations migrate to cloud-based ERP systems, and there's a huge advantage here from that standpoint as well. For an EPO platform, it's essentially completely decoupled. The connectivity and payments capabilities are completely decoupled from the ERP systems themselves, right? So What they rely on is the files coming out of the ERP systems that really indicate who you want to pay, right? Those payment files. But if you think about moving from one ERP to another, that's really just one connection, right? The system that's sending in those source files. And then from the EPO platform itself is all the other criteria, the payment formats, the connectivity to the banks, right? The file movements back and forth. So it becomes a lot easier to migrate these connections from one system to another when you just have this almost one point of connection to contemplate in that whole process, the EPO platform.
I'd like to transition from some of the pain sets to this mindset, because I'll go through just a couple of these, the general terms that we use in this space that are more system or structure related. So when we say payment hub, or we say treasury aggregator, a payment hub is the system that supports, generating payments, sending them to different networks or directly, handling different formats, validations, compliance. And a treasury aggregator includes a payment hub as well as the inbound activity. A payment factory is, might be an area that handles payments, might be some center of payment excellence or center of excellence, where it's an organization. We've talked about the EPO mindset, which maybe you could describe that in terms of, it's not just a system, is it? What's included in the mindset?
Yeah, so I think from a what is EPO from a product perspective, I think it's more so, taking a lot of the functionality that you described before, but thinking of it more from the ecosystem perspective, right? So it's not necessarily a product that's built for a specific function to process payments, to translate file formats and things like that. It's really an ecosystem that takes all of that and really makes it accessible broadly across the organization to facilitate EPO. So really the ability to, first of all, receive payment files and process payment activity across the entire organization. But also, really give you full access to all the data that's occurring there, so you can leverage it for other purposes as well, whether it be analytics purposes on your own, or even, fraud prevention purposes, like, things like pattern recognition and things like that, really. Really unchaining all that data, like I mentioned before, so that you can use it more strategically. That's, in my mind, really what EPO is. But it definitely is also a mindset, right? So one common thing that we always do for our customers when we kind of have initial conversations here is talk about our EPO maturity model. So this is a model where we kind of assess the client's current processes in terms of where they stand in terms of the maturity model that we've developed here. You have isolated processes, you have controlled processes, network processes, and finally, these fully optimized payment processes as well. And one thing that we do is we always go through and kind of map each one of their individual payment processes into one of these buckets. We explain the traits pertaining to being in that stage of payment optimization, the inefficiencies, and really how it's inhibiting them from acting strategically. And from that perspective, it's an eye opener, but it really facilitates that mindset, right, of EPO and what there is to be gained by optimizing these processes as well. So yeah, it can be a bit of an initial shock, I'd say, for a lot of organizations. A lot of organizations don't even have a full mapping of all their payment processes to begin with, which is really interesting too, right? So they don't even know all the ways that they're executing payments. But once they understand the deficiencies and they have the tools to actually correct them through, an EPO strategy and platform, everything changes, right? The organizations feel much more empowered. There's a mindset of continuous improvement that they fall into quite easily here. And the owners of the payment process really become experts, and they're able to assess each situation, determine where it fits in terms of this maturity model, really what needs to change, and how they can fold this into their EPO platform and process to kind of get to a more optimized state.
I like that. Isolate, control, network, and optimize. There's some nice texture there. We think of oblivious, observe, oversee, own, or oppress. And usually the oblivious and oppress is a pejorative, but this whole, observe sort of fits with the isolation. Oversee is control and perhaps network, and then own is what do you do on the, this optimization side. So I think there's some good overlap. But you said something that was really interesting, and we see it a lot in our advisory business, particularly on security and payments, is you mentioned the inventory. When you say people are surprised they don't have an inventory of all their payment processes. Our experience is that when people are saying, yeah, we think we have this many payment processes, it's usually 2 to 3 times the number of what they say. We had one company say we have 25, and they went and continued the process. They were over 50 by the time they felt it was comprehensive, and it's delivered all kinds of different ways, through portals, through bank accounts that may not even be centrally tracked. And that's in today's world. In yesterday's world, that was scary. In today's world, I would say that's unacceptable. You can't say, oh, we have these 5 payment processes locked down, but these other 10, we don't know what happens. And maybe our limit's not so much. We don't keep enough cash in the accounts. We're not concerned. There's all kinds of excuses as to why nobody owns it or nobody has this optimized mindset or this enterprise mindset. I don't know. Do those numbers match with what you see too?
Yeah, I'd say absolutely. Yeah, not surprising to hear that at all. It's people tend to think in terms of their main payment processes, but they forget about the legacy ERP that's hanging out there, or some sort of subsidiary of their business or something like that. So most organizations definitely do not have that full mapping of their payment process for sure. And I think by and large, people do want to optimize those processes, combine them. They just don't have the right tools to do so, right? So, and that's what EPO does. It gives them the tools to be able to take a look at those outliers of your payment process and really have a strategy for what you can do moving forward with those.
You talked about data and getting data out for analytics, unchaining the data. You talked about it for fraud, and I think the view of we can see payment history, speed, and can leverage that with machine learning. So I think that's pretty clear. But do you have an example on the analytics side, like what you can do with that data that enriches an organization?
Yeah, so I think really from 2 standpoints. So, presently, I think you made a point earlier in the conversation that was a good one about cash flow forecasting. Payables are obviously a big piece of that. That's your biggest variable cash outflow. Organizations try to project out their payables based on AP balances in the ERP and financial data, but it's not perfect. You never know what's going to actually get picked up in that AP run when it gets executed. And so a lot of organizations are reactive in that respect, right? They're finding out what's going to be clear for payables once it's been initiated or even after it's cleared the bank, right? So having that data in terms of how payments are flowing through your environment from an EPO standpoint, seeing everything at the point of really initiation there is valuable for organizations for cash flow forecasting as well. You can't rely, everybody wants to manage cash flow in real time cash visibility. That's such a key term in Treasury these days. But it involves more than just bank data, right? It's not just having real-time visibility into your bank data. It's actually having real-time visibility into some of these systems that are generating payments as well, right? Creating those payment requests. So that's one way where I think EPO helps immensely. But even taking that and being a little bit more forward-looking about it, really to take advantage of some of the functionalities that are coming to market now that are really kind of interesting for treasurers, I think. Predictive modeling and AI for cash flow forecasting, for instance, right? Being able to more proactively analyze your trends and better project out cash based on those trends. You need data to do that, you know what I mean? You need to have that data in order to run those predictive analytics models. And so you almost need something like EPO as a predecessor for that. You could say the same thing about, for example, pattern recognition for fraud detection, right? Pattern recognition is a very powerful tool for fraud detection, but it needs data. It can only detect patterns in the data that it has. So, this is kind of what I mean by unchaining this data, so to speak.
I mean, there's some aspect where payment data is secure. It needs to be anonymized, but if you're able to pull and get some of the other data, there's a lot more that you can do with it. Otherwise, it's just like, we can't access it. Therefore, we can't analyze, we can't determine anything that's going on. John, before we move on to your final thoughts about enterprise payment optimization, I wanted to poke you a little bit on the payment experts. You talked about payment experts earlier. This is less system oriented. You talked about the isolate, control, network optimize. That's an overall organizational perspective. And then there's what are people doing? Who are the payment experts? What needs to happen here for this mindset with the people?
Yeah, sure. I could definitely go into that. And that's a journey we always see, I think, during the course of our customer engagements as well. As I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, that the treasurers are usually making the introductions to the banks, steering things from a project perspective, but they're not really in a position to be payment experts per se, right? And really advise the business in that respect. And these are things that change completely once organizations move to this EPO model and they have a platform to rely on. For example, I have a couple different customer situations that I think are pretty interesting. First was a company that was processing payments in the Asian market, one of their Asian markets with a third-party provider. Regulations changed, and they were no longer able to send those files out and have them processed through a third-party provider's bank account. They actually needed to be processed from an in-house bank account, right? And so, because they had an EPO strategy and platform available to them, essentially what they did was open up a new bank account, and then they took those payment files that were being routed to the third-party provider, routed them through the platform itself, converted them to XML-based payment files, sent them directly out to the banks that way through connectivity that we had already established, right? So in that case, they had a solution right away. That if they didn't have this platform, they'd probably be scurrying to try to put in place, something of straight-through processing and contemplate file formats. But they were in a position to really advise the business on how to change this process.
John, I like that example. This whole, what NACHA refers to as third-party senders. There's just increased scrutiny across the globe, and that's a really good example of, hey, you can't send it through somebody else. You've got to do it directly. How can you be nimble and move quick? That's great. And I think I cut you off. I think you were starting with another example.
Yeah, I mean, the only other example I wanted to bring up was actually for U.S. payroll. So a company that was processing their U.S. payroll in-house. And payroll is one of those departments that never really gets to leverage the latest technology for bank connectivity. Typically, they have some sort of SFTP connection to transmit NACHA direct deposit files through. They get their reporting, their confirmations through the e-banking portal, and they really only find out if something's wrong if they get the phone call directly from the bank after the bank's gone through the contact list, and it's usually a late hour where the organization really can't do anything. And so this particular customer is really looking to avoid that, move to a better process. They had the EPO strategy in place, right, an EPO platform. So what they were able to suggest to the payroll department was route these NACHA files through the EPO platform. They'll be converted to XML-based payment files. Based on that, you can take advantage of XML-based confirmation files, which typically come in just about instantly after you've transmitted these files off to the banks, both batch level and transaction level confirmations. And the payroll department was no longer kind of subject to just using the reporting on the bank portal to confirm successful transactions. They could do that much, much quicker, right? And even more broadly across the organization, if anything was problematic about those files, more people were in the loop, alerted real time of those problems, right? So just another way that I think that once you have a strategy like this in place, you can really advise people on how things can change and be very nimble about it.
Yeah, that's the intersection of a clean business process with newer formats and this system visibility, this confirmation through XML. Now, John, for final thoughts, maybe you could either share general final thoughts, or maybe you could say, here are some of the main strategy pieces finance or payments professionals need to think about. So that's your podcast guest option. Either one of those, however you'd like to end it.
Yeah, sure. So I think I'll focus on maybe the component of continuous improvement, right? So the process never really changes. You're never really at the final end state of optimization. I think all treasury practitioners know that their businesses are constantly evolving. New ERPs are coming on board. You're doing acquisitions. You're migrating to new technology. Bank relationships are changing out, either by treasury's preference or because you have a new credit relationship. So flexibility is really key from this perspective. The strategy that you put in place needs to be able to allow for folding in of these changes quickly into this optimized state, or else you'll very quickly find out that what was optimized is no longer optimized, and you're continuing to kind of fall back into these more siloed processes. And it never stops for us either, right? So how we describe EPO probably will change, I would think, as things advance in the banking market as well. New ways of connecting with banks are emerging. Banks are getting more, robust in their API offerings and things like that. Instant payment methods are coming to market, and these are things that we're always advising our customers on as they become practical to use and things like that too. But EPO means being future-proof from that perspective. That your provider will always keep an eye on what's evolving in the market as well, and help you to kind of move into the right future state as well.
that makes me want to ask you questions about sunsetting of certain formats and other activities when you talk about future proofing, but we'll have to leave that for another podcast. John, thanks so much for your thoughts, times on this discussion of EPO.
Yeah, thank you very much, Craig, and thanks for having me.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.